Good afternoon. The Chungdong First Methodist Church English ministry pulpit is fast becoming one of my favorite pulpits. And I have stood here and preached on a number of occasions. Let me begin by expressing my very deep thanks and appreciation to your senior pastor, Reverend Paul Song, who is an alum of Claremont School of Theology. And also my deep appreciation to the Reverend Dr. Se-Hong Lee, one of my very, very dear friends. And in the last few years, I've gotten to know Dr. Lee and continue to develop a deep friendship with Dr. Lee and Dr. Lee's family. In fact, one of his sons was a student at Drew Theological School when I was his dean. And so this is a deep relationship that we have had over the years. And thank you to Chung-dong Church and to all the pastors for their gracious hospitality every time I come to visit Korea and to strengthen the relationship across the Pacific between the church in the United States and the church here in Korea. So thank you very much for this opportunity to bring the message to you this afternoon. Earlier this year, Claremont School of Theology lost one of her saints, Professor Emeritus Cornish R. Rogers. He was described in tributes with such words as generous, gracious, courageous, compassionate, and bold. Descriptions of his life and work include phrases like wise mentor, excellent teacher, dedicated pastor, supportive and proud father to his son David, and loving and devoted husband to his spouse Elsie. For those of us who knew him as a member of the Claremont School of Theology, the indelible impression Professor Rogers made actually goes beyond larger than life. It speaks of a lived life, a life of caring and dedication, a life well lived. While I did not know him as well as many other people, I knew him as a gracious man and generous in spirit. His contagious smile always glowed with radiance. In the bulletin for his memorial service, I saw the following quote from Professor Rogers. I commend these books and tapes of God's friends to all who would seek to infuse their lives with the life of God's refreshing Spirit. Indeed, the life and ministry of Professor Rogers was the life of one who infused his life with the life of God's refreshing Spirit. The Old Testament text takes us to the point in the story where the Israelites, under the leadership of Moses, are still in the Transjordanian area. They have been wandering in the wilderness for many years and confronted numerous challenges. God now reaches out to Moses and instructs him to put a leadership transitional plan in place. God tells Moses that because of his rebellion in the wilderness of Zin and not trusting God, but rather took matters into his own hands by striking the rock in Meribah to bring forth water for the people, he lost his privilege to lead the people into the promised land. God tells Moses to lay his hands on Joshua, designating him as his successor. Joshua is commissioned in the presence of the assembly of God's people. God refers to Joshua as a man in whom is the Spirit. Indeed, Joshua is one who has infused his life with the life of God's refreshing Spirit. Verse 20 in the New Revised Standard Version says, "You shall give him some of your authority so that all the congregation of the Israelites may obey." The Hebrew word translated as authority is hod. The Hebrew scholar Itamar Kislev, in seeing how the word is often paired with words like light and majesty, suggests that hod should probably be more correctly translated as radiance or a halo. Moses is told to rub some of his radiance off on Joshua. Such indeed is one who has infused her or his life with the life of God's refreshing Spirit. She or he infuses the radiance of God in her or his life. In the book of Acts, Luke the writer tells us that the story of the Jesus movement and the early church. It begins with the Pentecost, with the infusion of God's Spirit in the lives of the followers of Jesus. Beginning with the leaders, Peter and John, they began to carry out amazing ministry, and the movement grew quickly, in spite of the challenges and opposition they encountered. Chapter 6 relates the story of a dispute, a contention between the Hellenists and the Hebrews. The Hellenists complained against the Hebrews because their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution of food. To deal with the situation, the leaders instituted a new layer and a new structure of leadership, appointing a new group of leaders to attend to this particular task. The point that Luke makes is that this group of 7 are ones who are full of the Spirit and of wisdom. In other words, these are people who have infused their lives with the life of God's refreshing Spirit. Remember in the Numbers text, we are told that Moses imparted his radiance on Joshua in the leadership transition. Somehow, the New Testament text also captures the same connotation between spirit and radiance. Later in verse 15 of chapter 6, we are told that Stephen, one of the 7, found himself in a situation where his detractors brought charges to the religious council against him. There in the council, they looked intently at him, and they saw that his face was like the face of an angel. But we say too indeed that Stephen, infusing his life with the life of God's refreshing Spirit, infuses the radiance of God in his life. All of us who are claimed by God in Jesus Christ are called to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. We cannot do this sacred work without infusing our lives with the life of God's refreshing Spirit. Indeed, this is not what is required only of our leaders. This is fundamental to our identity as people of God who are called to be in ministry to serve others. Infused with the Spirit, we will effuse the radiance of God in our lives and ministry. I'm not sure how many of you are following our presidential election in the United States, which will be happening in a couple of days. In fact, a lot of people have already voted. We in the United States are at a critical point in our history where we have to decide what kind of a nation and a people we will become. Will we build walls in our southern border, ban an entire group of people from coming into the country because of their religious faith and identity, keep surveillance on religious communities in the name of preventing terrorism, disrespecting women and people who we do not agree with? Or will we build a democracy that builds bridges rather than walls, a democracy that should work for everyone and that does not single out and discriminate people because of their gender, race, ethnicity, class, and country of origin? We live in a world defined more and more by human fragmentation, hatred, violence, and terrorism. Times are tough. How do we do ministry in a world that is more and more polarized? In one of my many trips to Korea in the last few years, one of the topics of conversation I have had with friends and alumni is the changing Korean society. With the low birth rate and growing number of foreign students, interracial and interethnic marriages, an increasing globalized economic reality with the need for foreign workers in low-paying jobs, South Korea is confronting the prospect of becoming a multi-ethnic society. In an article in the Asia-Pacific section of the New York Times on November 29, 2012, the writer Cho Sang-hun raised the question in the title of his article. In changing South Korea, who counts as Korean? The article begins with the story of the election of Jasmine Lee in April 2012 to the South Korea's National Assembly. Born in the Philippines as Jasmine Bakone, Ms. Lee was the first naturalized citizen to win a seat in the National Assembly. Reflecting on the demographic shifts, Ms. Lee said, quote, "Koreans understand with their brain, but have yet to embrace with their heart." This has led Kim Yi-son, chief researcher on multiculturalism at the government-financed Korean Women's Development Institute, to say, quote, "It's time to redefine a Korean. Traditionally, a Korean meant someone born to Korean parents in Korea who speaks Korean and has Korean looks and nationality. People don't think someone is a Korean just because he has a Korean citizenship," end of quote. In response, the writer Cho Sang-hun noted that, quote, "Anti-immigration activists warned that poisonous weeds from abroad were corrupting the Korean bloodline and exterminating the Korean nation, and urged political parties to purify themselves by expelling Ms. Lee from the National Assembly," end of quote. He suggested too that South Korea faces a rough road ahead as it grapples with the demographic changes. Times are tough. How do you do ministry in a society that is becoming more and more multi-ethnic? The good news is, my friends, the contexts we find ourselves to do ministry, either in Korea or in the United States, is not really new and unprecedented. Stephen and the rest of the seven, Joshua, Cornish Rogers, had all been there before. They had had to face new and tough times in their own ministry as well. The seven were called to do ministry during a time of dispute and differences. New Testament scholars have debated about the Hellenists and the Hebrews. Some suggest that they are references to Gentile followers and Jewish followers of Jesus. Others suggest that they connote liberal versus conservative understandings of the temple and the law. The majority of New Testament scholars, however, see the Hellenists as Greek-speaking Jews and the Hebrews as Hebrew-speaking Jews who were all part of the Jesus movement. As Greek and Hebrew-speaking followers, they brought with them their own cultural and ideological differences. In fact, the 7 were probably already leaders of the Greek-speaking community. The New Testament scholar David Powell calls our attention to the fact that in Acts chapter 6, the complaint centers on whether the widows can participate in table fellowship. Noting that in the Lucan writings, the status of these widows is comparable to that of the tax collectors and sinners who are despised by the Pharisees and the scribes. Powell raised the question whether the dispute was one of discrimination and exclusion. Is it possible that the Hellenists were pushing for the early church to be a church that includes rather than excludes? Note too that the story of Stephen, as representative of the stories of the 7, immediately moved in the direction of relating the challenges that Stephen was soon to confront. Charges were brought against him to try to tear him down even as he sought to live out his calling, having infused his life with the life of God's refreshing Spirit and ultimately paying for it with his own life. Living into a new reality, times were tough for Stephen and his colleagues. Joshua was called to lead the people of God in a time when change was happening. Numbers chapter 7 begins with the story of the daughters of Zelophehad. In a highly patriarchal society, inheritance can only be passed on from father to sons. Zelophehad died without any sons. His 5 daughters did what would have been a no-no in Israelite society. They went to Moses to ask for their father's inheritance. Moses consulted God, and God affirmed that the daughters of Zelophehad are right in what they are saying. God overrode the people and granted inheritance rights to the daughters of Zelophehad. What a novel idea that must have been. In addition, as we read ahead in the story, we know that Joshua will be leading the people into the promised land where there will be hard-fought battles, confronting a changing context. Times were tough for Joshua. Cornish Rogers was the first African American to hold a tenure-track faculty position at Claremont School of Theology. In fact, he was the first non-white tenure-track faculty. While his arrival in 1980 followed a conscientious search process by the seminary to attract an African American scholar. As the first, I would not imagine that everything was smooth sailing for Professor Rogers. Those of us who have had the privilege of being the first in anything and any position can attest that we have had to face tough times. So moving into a new situation, times were probably tough for Cornish as well. As we live in a world and societies that are rapidly and constantly changing, let us infuse our lives with the life of God's refreshing Spirit to do what God has called us to do. Let us infuse the radiance of God in our lives. Changes are not always easy. But if we are open to the new things God is doing in our midst, we can all create a difference for the world that we live in. Amen.